Welcome to Light Camera Author, the show where storytelling meets history, culture, and creative mind behind the page. I'm your host, Jim Juno, and today's guest is journalist and author Mark Braude, whose riveting new book is called The Typewriter and the Guillotine, and it takes us to Paris between the two wars, a city of glamour and creativity, but also one standing unknowingly on the edge of catastrophe. At the center of the story is Janet Flanner, the pioneering New Yorker correspondent who chronicled Europe's cultural life while quietly sounding the alarm about the rise of fascism, all as Paris was transfixed by a sensational serial murder case that would end up in the last public guillotining in France. It's a book that blends biography, true crime, and political history, and it feels eerily relevant today. Mark Braude, welcome to Light Camera Author.
Hey, thanks so much, Jim. I've been looking forward to it.
Now let's start at the beginning. The typewriter and the guillotine. It weaves together Janet Flanner's life and a notorious murder case, while also the unraveling of politics in Europe. I mean, it was a time that World War II was on the cusp and everything was breaking down. So let me ask you, what first pulled you into this story?
So I knew about Janet Flanner just as a general, somebody who writes about France, was familiar with her writing at the New Yorker, and I really thought she was this really, I think, key voice, maybe a wrongly overlooked voice in the 20th century cultural history, as this major driving force behind the early years of the New Yorker. She was there right from the beginning, in their first year in 1925, writing these letters from Paris, and I think helped to really transform that magazine from being this very American centric and humor focused magazine when it started out to really this international icon of quality reportage that we know today. And I think that story of hers is really interesting and somebody that I looked at. Um, but what made me really want to write a book about her wasn't so much that I wanted to do the cradle to grave biography, but that she had this very specific arc, and that you mentioned, I think became increasingly more timely the more I was working on the book. It wasn't meant to be timely, but
Mhm.
this arc from the 20s to the 30s. So she starts out with this assignment to write about what's going on in Paris, art wise, fashion wise. Tell me about the new ballets. What are the cool drinks at the Ritz? Those kinds of things. And she does it well, and she does it with great humor. And then just because of where she was, as you say, she's witness to this great unraveling. She's there in the 30s, and now the stories of the day are the rise of Mussolini, the rise of Hitler, the rise of extremist politics right in her backyard in Paris and in France. And I loved thinking about somebody who had to tackle that shift and try to grapple with those questions of what do you do when your job is really starting to feel out of step with your chaotic times, and people are starting to really question the very bedrocks of democracy, of cooperation, of even truth itself. And I think watching her grapple with those questions in this peak of her career in the 20s and the 30s through her writing and through her actions was something that was really interesting to me. Um, and then
Go
it
ahead.
so
Mhm.
happened, as I was following her and really reading everything she wrote, I mean, everything, um, I noted that one of the last pieces she filed um, before she fled France in 1939 was actually the story that I kind of knew myself beforehand, this guillotining of this German man named Eugen Weidmann, famous relatively, I mean, in French history, as an anecdote, as the last person, as you said, publicly executed, in front of a crowd,
Mhm.
right outside the gates of the Versailles prison. And the date of that execution, June 1939, and he was a German, that made it an interesting story to me. And then the fact that it turned out that Flanner had covered him throughout, the sensational trial of his crimes, his capture, and then the execution, made me think that there was some bigger story here that could be told by weaving in those two narratives together. And then once I started to look at Weidman in detail closely, I realized, it was so much more than just this anecdote about the end of his life. Really, his rise and his crimes, and the trial, especially following them, alongside Flanner, could really tell us a lot about this quite dark period in history.
You mentioned that, like you said, she was hired by the New Yorker's Harold Ross to write about, well, for want of a better term, fluff pieces. I mean, it was about art, fashion, and society. But she recognized what was happening. Didn't she write a expose? Well, if that's the right word, expose on Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, it's interesting because the assignment in some ways could be read as fluffy, but she took it and she took it kind of with lightly at first. It was this idea of what's ephemeral, what's in fashion, what's changing, and that in itself, although it was very important to her and is very important to me and important to many, can be read as something that's not lasting, right? Because you're always trying to look at what's new and what's hip and what's changing. But she started to really excel at it and write these very literary pieces on what was happening in front of her in Paris. So it very quickly changed from a fluff assignment to something she took very seriously, and her readers appreciated. She was very keen at making deep insights into things that might seem light, but she's always doing it through this sort of gimlet eye, very funny. I'll give you an example. For instance, she writes about these are the kinds of stories she was writing in the 20s. She writes about the fact that the woman who invented camembert cheese, this farmer, her little village had erected a stone sculpture in her honor. And Flanner says, it looks a lot like a Gruyere, like the stone shaft of a Gruyere, not a camembert. There is no justice, is how she wrote it. So that's like a very niche, to joke about the shape of cheeses is a bit of a niche audience, but like it made me laugh 100 years later. And that's hard to do with journalism and with humor to really be funny 100 years after the fact. But she was very good and very cutting and really keen to see these absurd little things in whatever she was writing about. And as you said, yes, then she starts to really push the magazine to going into this political realm and pitches Ross very hard on this. I want to go profile Adolf Hitler. And to some initial resistance, eventually did get a three-piece, three-issue, multi-thousand word profile on Hitler in the mid 30s, at a point when he's still somewhat of an unknown quantity in America. For many, I would make the argument that their first real in-depth analysis of Hitler as a person might have come through Flanner's extended profile, and it certainly did make her quite famous at the time of its publication.
Yes, I remember in research that I've done, it was like before World War II started, before he invaded Poland. It was more or less appeasement, like let him have Austria, let him have the Sudetenland, let him. He's a nobody. What do we care? Or along those lines. Isolationism, I guess, is what it was. But she actually saw his danger, didn't she?
Yeah, she's an interesting case in that regard because she did and she didn't. She was right off the bat said, this is somebody we need to pay attention to. And I'm talking 33, 34, like way more than we are as Americans, she's saying. This is the person that's going to affect the most change in Europe, and that is going to affect the most change in the world. She saw that very early. But I think why I liked following her in the 30s is she isn't instantly this great hero who says, this will not stand, and I am 100% against this from the get-go, and I'm going to tell everyone. She is trying, she sees that there's something scary, and she tries on the page almost to will it away. It's this kind of magical thinking that I think a lot of people grappled with in the 30s of it can't be this bad. It is this bad, and I don't want it to be this bad. And she's trying to figure it out, trying to figure him out, privately writing that she's terrified of him and terrified of the Germans who are supporting him more so. She said she's seen Hitler and she's seen the people who support Hitler, and she's scared of the second far more than the first. But on the page, trying to rationalize, trying to say, well, how do we get out of this? And, until it's sort of too late. So in some ways, the great Warner, the great Cassandra, and then in some other ways, the great, stuck in this maze of what do we do? How do we get out of this, in a sense? That makes sense.
Exactly. No, that makes total sense. Now, the title, the typewriter, and the guillotine. Now, we've talked about the typewriter part of it with Janet Flanner. Now let's talk a little bit about the guillotine part of it with oh gosh, let me butcher his name. Um, I may let you
Eugen
do it.
Weidmann.
Huh? What's that?
Eugen Weidmann is what
Eugen
it,
Weidmann. That's right. Okay, I was gonna go with Eugene.
we might call him Eugen, right?
Eugen Weidmann. No, he was a murderer, no doubt about that. Like you said, though, he was German, and it was the last public use of the guillotine in France, and there was a real reason why this was the last public guillotining is because of a lot of it what happened with the public after he had lost his head. Forgive the pun. That's really what led to the banning of it, wasn't it?
Hmm. So yeah, I thought that this was a really illustrative case for Flanner and the rest of, people in Europe trying to grapple with this unfathomable evil. Well, here was one person who embodied, these inexplicable crimes. He was a serial killer, killed six people in and around Paris in the late 30s, um, and really impossible to deduce his reasoning. He took these small sums from the people that he murdered, and it kind of looked like these robberies. Um, and he was a kind of a con man, but really it comes out that he's just sort of a cipher. He's really a psychopath. And and so Flanner, in trying to cover this case, it becomes this story about the story itself. Here's a German in France. How are we going to deal with him in a just way when we have no way of explaining his evil? And the lawyer who takes him on is a noted anti-fascist and a noted opponent of the death penalty. And his defense, without giving too much away for readers, is really ingenious, and it ties in to the larger political stakes of Nazi Germany and Germany's relation with France. And so the story, as Flanner really realizes early on, is about politics. She calls it a small and sinister European entanglement. And she sees in all the players, the French victims, there was an American victim, and this German killer, a bigger story being told about Europe as it's unfolding. And then it caps with this great bloody, execution that is filmed, that's photographed, that becomes a media story, that's witnessed by hundreds of people who are there almost like as if they're watching a prize fight. And the reaction from the crowd is deemed so outrageous. People kind of popping champagne corks as his head gets cut off. People dipping their garments in the blood of this executed person because it's supposed to bring good luck. Um, this French state very quickly outlaws public executions afterwards in the aftermath of this, in response to that crowd's behavior. And anyway, it's all there's a lot to that case, and there's a lot to Flanner's coverage of that case that I think are the real meat of this book.
Yeah, no, and reading the book today, it's hard not to see the parallels between with political extremism, disinformation, cultural distraction. Did you think about when you were writing the typewriter and the guillotine? Did it change how you think about the role of journalists now?
It was really interesting to be kind of turning away from the real world into this world, and trying to keep both separated, because that's really, what I try to do as a historian is really be true to the material. But one couldn't help but think, and like I said, this is a years old project, and so it's not necessarily written in response to the times, but it does feel timely. It was really interesting, fascinating, to see a journalist confronted with really this immense amount of change and this immense amount of fear, trying to keep her head. Um, and the beauty of having what she had, this assignment, which was the letters from Paris. She wrote every 2 weeks for the New Yorker, and it could be on whatever she wanted. It was a steady gig. She ended up holding this job for 50 years, actually, writing these letters. Um, but it was quite beautiful to see somebody who had time to think. She could write very carefully. She could revise. She could disagree with herself. She could try to cover all these things from as many angles as she could. And I think that was really refreshing and lovely to see as somebody who's not really pressured for the hot take, um, and not necessarily driven by the need to be adversarial. Although, of course, the Times did call for somebody adversarial, and that's a blessing and a curse of her writing, is that she did try to kind of play diplomat, and readers will have their own takeaways from that. But in terms of her delivery, her style, that was really great. And then the last thing I'll say on her as a journalist, I think her great innovation and something that I think we see echoes of in writing today, and I think where she was really influential, is that she kept the style that made her in the 20s when she was covering Picasso and the Ballet Russe and Josephine Baker and all the rest, and trying to find the humor and the light and the beauty. She kept a lot of that tone even while she's writing about Franco's bombs and refugees. And it sounds kind of sick when I say it out loud, but if you look at it on the page and can really appreciate it, she's doing something completely new, which is she's trying to write just as she was in the style that she knows, even though the news is getting harder and darker. And I think even that is in and of itself a kind of form of resistance, a kind of rebuke to say, not everything has to be ugly and hateful. I can try to stay true to myself in the way I write and the way I see the world, even at this dark time, and not turn away from it, go right towards it, but do it in my own way.
Now, if she was reporting today, what do you think she'd be paying attention to that maybe we're overlooking?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I have specifics. I think that what she said was that she loved the high and the low. She said the middle bored her. Um, and so she looked for, that's a kind of a class thing. She was kind of conservative in her tastes artistically. But she did also like this very, what she would call the low life and the new, and the wild. So I don't know what she'd be looking at specifically, but I think that any story that would be confronting us today, she would find some back alley side door way to get into it. That was really her gift. Was that, and I think maybe that's the gift of time, and maybe that's the gift of the New Yorker's resources and editorial team as well, of saying, okay, here's the thing, here's the hot take. We're all angry about this, or we're all really blindsided by this, or we really want to know more about this. But what if we look at it, from this way? And so and that's, I think we've seen examples of great journalism that do that. Kennedy's assassination, I think it was, and let's look at the Gravedigger, was it? I mean, I think that might have been a famous piece in the history of journalism.
Mhm.
I might have been butchering it, but those kinds of side doorways in, where you're getting at the human story, where you're getting at the unexpected, I think she was really great at.
Well, Mark Braude, the book is The Typewriter and the Guillotine. It's a gripping, thought-provoking read and one that feels as urgent now as the history it explores. I want to thank you, Mark, for being on Lights Camera Author today.
No, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I'm Jim Juno. I want to thank everyone for listening, and if you like what you're hearing and seeing, please like and subscribe. It keeps us going. So until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.